We are going to jump into a mindfulness exercise, but before we do that, let me just introduce what this live is going to be about, because this is the fourth installment of a series that we're doing on the different modules in DBT. So if you didn't see the previous episodes of this series, you can find them all on our YouTube channel. We've already done distress tolerance, mindfulness, emotion regulation, and that brings us to today's event, which is interpersonal effectiveness. Super excited to close out this series with my co-founders and our amazing guest, Dr. Kiki Fehling. So thank you all for being here. We're looking forward to taking your questions today. And as we did for the mindfulness exercise, we'd like to kick it off with a mindfulness exercise, or the mindfulness episode. We'd like to do a mindfulness exercise, especially after the technical issues. I could use
a moment
right now, Alicia. Help us out. Yes.
All right. So where we were before, if you were with us, you can close your eyes or find a place to rest your eyes. Having a posture that is both awake and alert, but also relaxed. And noticing your breath as you breathe in and breathing out. Following the breath as you're inhaling and exhaling. You don't have to do anything to change your breathing. Just see if you can bring all your awareness and attention to it. And if you've noticed your mind getting distracted, as mind often do, just notice that and gently bring it back to this moment, this inhale and exhale out. And you will end with a really deep breath in. So on your next breath, really filling your lungs with air. And slow exhale out. You can open your eyes and rejoin us. Here we are.
Thank you, Alicia.
You're welcome.
So since this is about interpersonal effectiveness, as we have done in other episodes, I think it would be great to just start with having one of you just share a quick overview. What is the module about? What's the primer we could start this conversation with today?
No, it's always like, who's gonna take it? Interpersonal effectiveness. I often, when I'm trying to describe this unit, basically summarize it as communication skills. I mean, they really are communication skills when we're thinking about how do we ask for things, how do we say no to things we don't want, how do we interpersonally engage with people in a way that's going to be effective, right? And so for some people, they really struggle with setting boundaries, setting limits, saying no. They often will say yes to everything. Other people might have the opposite, where like maybe they actually need to broaden and there need to be a little bit more give and take. And so part of it is understanding, well, what is my goal? You know, what is it I actually want? How do I want the other person to feel about me? Like, how do I want the relationship to be? Is the relationship important? Right? And the more important it is, there's relationship skills that we teach that enhance relationships and keep relationships. And then how do I want to feel about myself in terms of my own self-respect? So kind of I don't know if you add anything there, Jesse.
Or Kiki. Kiki, any thoughts?
I don't think so.
Maybe you can share a little bit about, because this is part of a series too, a few words, maybe Kiki, I'm going to turn it over to you to just share about how does interpersonal effectiveness relate to the other modules that we've already had conversations about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't remember who answered this last time, but mindfulness is a part of everything. So it's a part of interpersonal effectiveness. We have to like be present with the people we're with and present with ourselves in order to know what we want and ask for it effectively and respond effectively to what the people around us are saying and doing. Distress tolerance, I think, can be really effective in the sense of crisis intervention, like when we are handling difficult conversations that are very stressful. A lot of times, crisis intervention, like tip skills, lowering our emotionality, can be really helpful to maintain that conversation, to stay in it, or when we take breaks to calm down quick and come back to it. And radical acceptance can be really useful because we cannot always get what we want from other people. So accepting relationships as they are while working towards change, which maybe brings us to emotion regulation. A lot of times when there are problems in the environment or in our worlds, it's going to involve interpersonal effectiveness skills to change things, to get things that we want in order to change our emotions, whether we're angry at somebody and want to like assert boundaries, that's emotion regulation, or whether we're really happy and in love with somebody and we want to express how we feel about them in a positive way and get more of that. For emotion regulation, communication is going to be really relevant there. And I think all combined interpersonal effectiveness often involves like being our best selves within relationships and recognizing the interconnectedness between all of us all of the time. So increasing our ability to live in relationship with others is going to then positively impact all the other skills beyond those skills, helping us in relationships.
Awesome. That's great. I know that this is a topic that has come up before. For some reason, I often think of interpersonal effectiveness as a great module to take after having taken the other ones, because so many things build up to interpersonal effectiveness. At the same time, I want to recognize that we've sort of acknowledged that the order in which you take these modules is maybe less important. But can you share a little bit about, like, when you think about interpersonal effectiveness skills, particularly when you use them in sequence with other skills, where does it fit in like from the perspective of skill stacking?
I mean, I think, Roland, I think one important thing to highlight is that, folks experience skills deficits in various, in skill and skillfulness in various different ways. For instance, I, for the most part, don't necessarily tend to experience like intense 8, 9, 10 emotions a lot. And so I don't necessarily experience major skills deficits when it comes to tolerating distress. And I tend to experience skills deficits, let's say if we're talking about certain interpersonal effectiveness skills, let's say like maintaining my limits or maintaining my self-respect. Like, so I just want to highlight for folks, depending on your own experience, certain skills may feel more enhancing and more applicable than others. So it's just sort of answering that first part of the question. Now, in terms of skills stacking, like how to use skills in combination with one another, I think something that comes to mind is that like emotion dysregulation and BPD, that the diagnosis is increasingly being thought of as an interpersonal relationship. I don't want to call it a disorder, but it issues relating to interpersonal relationships. In that oftentimes the thing that tends to cue distress and unwanted emotions and discomfort is conflict and with others, feelings of shame that can be attributed to other relationships, but it's an interpersonal dysregulation. So in that respect, I can imagine, pairing all these skills together as part of interpersonal effectiveness and to help increase our interpersonal effectiveness is critical. I'm curious, Kiki and Alicia, your respective thoughts.
Well, I want to take it, I mean, I guess I want to broaden that. I mean, being human is to have interpersonal conflict, right? I mean, we all, when we think about relationships, like we are social creatures, we need tribe, we need connection, and they can be the source of so much joy and love and wonderful community. And they can be the source of a lot of pain and stress, right? When relationships are not going well. And so, or if we feel rejected, or we feel hurt, or we feel misunderstood, like all of those moments when we are feeling unseen, right? Or our needs are not getting met, or we feel shamed in some way in the dynamic. To go to ask to your question about the skill stacking, I often think of like when we get triggered emotionally, something might happen interpersonally for all of us. We could get triggered emotionally in a situation, right? And then we may need to step out of the conversation in order to be more effective, because even the most skillful person, I think I know the DBT skills really well. Like I am not able to be super skillful interpersonally if I am at 100, right?
Yeah.
If I am really elevated in my emotional state, I'm not going to communicate effectively, right? And that is when like distress tolerance might be needed to bring it down. And then maybe even some checking the facts, some emotion regulation once I'm a little bit more reasonable mind. And then I could come back and use some interpersonal effectiveness skill to say, hey, you know, when you, Roland, when you said that thing to me, my feelings got really hurt, you know, and have a conversation about it.
Yeah. In some ways, I do hear there is something about it. You're coming back in many cases to an interpersonal effectiveness skill, maybe at the end of a sequence of engagements, and that at least in the example that you just provided.
Yeah. Kiki, I'm curious how you sort of think about these things relating.
Yeah, I mean, something that I'm hearing about maybe integrating your two answers is that I can think about moments, especially if you cope ahead, which is a skill from emotional regulation, where if you cope ahead for the types of conflicts or interpersonal triggers or relational prompts that drive dysregulation for you, like I have seen both in my personal life and clients, like using an assert of, can you help me regulate right now? Can you do tip skill with me? I need you to apologize. You hurt my feelings. Like whatever that brief skill is to indicate to the person, actually, I need help right now, co-regulating. Like, because that's a real thing as social beings, like using our relationships and people who love us and want to support us to help us regulate our emotions. So I see some ways in which getting validation from our loved one who's good at it actually being a very effective emotion regulation skill, even before you practice tip skills, for example, or whatever. But
Kiki, I'm glad you bring this up, because I do think sometimes it can feel almost like some of the skills, like so much of the regulation is on us as individuals. And I do think that sometimes it feels like something's a little bit missing in that, to your point, you know, we are individuals, we are beings who experience co-regulation. And to that end, like validation, the validation skills, like the give skills that we'll be talking about, can be really effective at helping one another tolerate distress and emotionally regulate. And I sometimes feel like maybe that's sort of missing from the piece. Like so much of the onus, it can feel like, is on us to do all this heavy lifting.
Yeah.
That's a maybe good segue to a last question maybe I can ask that will help us level set for the rest of our conversation, which is that in the workplace today, there is a tremendous conversation happening around EQ, or emotional intelligence. And I'm curious, like when you talked about, Jesse, about co-regulating, like that can express itself actually in the form of teams. Like, do teams know how to do that for each other and support each other? I'm just curious, what do you see as the relationship between something like EQ in the workplace and interpersonal effectiveness as a module in DBT?
I mean, and I think we could broaden this to be not just in the workplace, but in relationships broadly.
Sure.
I mean, Alicia, Kiki, do you have any initial thoughts?
So I'm like hearkening back to, I don't know if it's on the EPPP, or just my undergraduate education, but like EQ, right, is like understanding and reading and knowing emotions in oneself and other people, and then how to manipulate emotions. And I don't mean the negative connotation, but like regulate emotions in
Mm-hmm.
ourselves and others. And so I, I mean, just like inherently, interpersonal effectiveness is going to be so relevant. Mindfulness of other people, which is getting us, I mean, this is the way everything is interconnected. But the give skills, right? If you're the one, which is one module or one part of the interpersonal effectiveness skills that was focused on relationship building, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but like knowing how to talk to someone, literally like nonverbal, how you talk, and then verbal, what do you say, is able to modulate both your emotions and the emotions in the other person. So I see this as being incredibly related, and I think DBT just gives like a very concrete set of techniques to use that could be useful for someone trying to increase their EQ in the category of like regulating emotions between people.
Yeah.
I
I was also thinking about our dime game.
Mm,
You know, in terms of the intensity of asking, like having some general EQ can be really helpful, like when reading other people on your team, like in terms of like, do they have the bandwidth? Is this a good time to
mhm.
ask? Like, are they able to do my request? Like all of those things, you know, in terms of factors to consider when negotiating tasks between each other.
I I I think, and sort of building on what you both said, like I almost think there's like a bit of a dialectic here between like what I would call like protocol and principle. So like on the one hand, like we have like really specific skills that at times can feel almost like sort of prescriptive in a way, like dear man,
Mm,
where it's like, okay, and this is a way of communicating with someone that captures some of that EQ quality, right? Like if we were to observe someone engaging in EQ behaviors, like these are some things that they may do, and emotionally quote unquote intelligent. I'm not an expert on EQ, so I'm just
Yeah.
imagining what that would mean. I think at the other end is sort of like the principle, which in many ways is trying to imagine with curiosity and non judgment what is going on for another person. Like trying to be curious, like what is another person's
Mm-hmm.
experience? And I kind of feel like that principle sort of is the foundation through which a lot of these other things we can sit on. And I actually, one of my favorite set of skills is not included in the adult manual are the think skills in the adolescent manual, which is almost an acronym for a set of skills that is about enhancing that imaginal exercise of thinking about like what is another person thinking? What is it that they're feeling?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is sort of speaks to that sort of process of emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Again, without actually knowing what emotional intelligence
I
means.
love that. I heard a little bit of mindfulness there and also a little bit of dialectics. We also mentioned, you mentioned a couple skills already that for those listeners who aren't familiar with those skills, maybe we should just explain what those are. And before you do that, just a reminder to anybody in the live, please feel free to ask questions. We are here to answer them. So ask away. Who would like to share a little bit about I heard the give skill mentioned, and I think one other.
dear man.
Dear man.
Your man, yes.
So at the top of the hour, Alicia mentioned that a big part of interpersonal effectiveness is navigating like three categories of interpersonal effectiveness, like asserting your needs or like saying to what you want and getting what you want, relationship, improving the relationship, three, self-respect, like making sure you feel good about yourself after an interaction. And so these kind of weird, strange words, if people aren't familiar with DBT, are coming from like a set of skills from each of those three areas. So the first one, getting what you want or asserting yourself. Dear man is an acronym that we often use to describe a set of skills for doing that, for asserting your needs. The give skills is another acronym that applies to the relationship category of improving relationships through interpersonal effectiveness. And then the final one that I don't think we've mentioned yet is FAST, an acronym as a part of the self-respect acronym for making sure that during and after an interaction, you still feel good and proud and like steady in yourself.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there any other skills that we should just mention here so that people are aware of like some of the most important skills within interpersonal effectiveness?
Alicia already mentioned the dime game, so I bring that up again. That's a skill that kind of applies to all the areas, but it's about figuring out like how assertively or strongly to ask for something or to say no. I briefly mentioned mindfulness of others, kind of one of those crossover skills between mindfulness and interpersonal effectiveness. There are skills that aren't always taught, about finding and keeping new friendships and relationships. There are skills for ending problematic or like toxic relationships you don't want to be in anymore. And then like there's a set of skills that's a part of the give skills, but I always like mentioning specifically, which is self-validation. And then also validation skills. Like we really emphasize validation in DBT, both validating others and ourselves, and that's a part of interpersonal effectiveness.
And Kiki, building on that, also like skills for recovering from invalidation.
Thank you.
As well, which I think is huge. And there's also like packed in there, like there's like the walking the middle path and like all the behaviors and stuff, which is sometimes like its own separate
Kind of
module, but it's sometimes
own thing. Yeah.
like thrown in. I think in some respect it's sort
Can you
of wedged in. Yeah, okay. Oh, like I guess we should talk. Alicia, do you want to give a bit of a description on on walking the middle path?
Yeah. I mean, walking the middle path is usually 3 skills taught in that, and the validation often is taught in that section too, and recovering from invalidation, although it's very connected to the give skills. But the other 2 are dialectics, the D and DBT, which is the dialectics. And when I think about dialectics, it's the both end. Have we talked about dialectic before? I can't remember.
Yes, with Andrea.
With Andrea, right? Okay. And then there's also reinforcement and oral behaviorism. I would should say behaviorism 101, because it's reinforcement. We talk about punishment, both positive and negative reinforcement, but mainly like how do we change our own behaviors? How do we stop ourselves from doing behaviors we don't want to do or other people? So those are the behavioral change skills.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Hopefully that gives people a sense of there's a lot in your personal effectiveness module.
Packed in.
Yeah, so that might be a good segue to just share or to ask if for somebody who's new to DBT, thinking about starting to learn, where would you guide somebody to start working on interpersonal effectiveness skills? Jesse, as our curriculum designer at TheraHive, would you like to take that one?
I mean, I do think that, okay, where would you start? Well, I mean, one, Kiki, I want to highlight, you have an exceptional book that helps introduce a lot of these skills, which is fabulous. I think like if we're thinking specifically within like the manual part, like the beginning of the manual does a really lovely job doing 2 things in my mind. And Kiki and Alicia, I'm curious. So one thing it does is that it orients folks to the purpose and function of these skills. And it talks about things that can get in the way of interpersonal effectiveness. It talks about skills deficits. It talks about, how emotions can get in the way, like beliefs about like interpersonal myths. For instance, like if I ask for help, that means I'm weak and I shouldn't. Or, if I rely on someone.
You already know what I want. You should already know what I want.
You should already know what I want. So I love that sort of framing because it sort of identifies like here are some of the things that get in the way of interpersonal effectiveness. And then further on, it sort of introduces like our 3 sort of primary goals engaging in any interpersonal situation. And so it orients us, and Alicia and Kiki already sort of addressed this, to like these 3 things. And I want to hold that sometimes all 3 can be involved, and it can be really challenging to sort of prioritize them. But in general, we've sort of hold 3 things in mind. Am I focused on getting something from the other person or saying no? Am I focused on the relationship so that after the situation leaves, I want the relationship and that person to think well of me? And or am I focused on maintaining my self-respect? Do I want to leave this situation feeling good about how I communicated. I think Marcia does a really fabulous job laying all those things out.
Mm-hmm. And I think knowing your goal for each of those three things is where you start, because in order to be interpersonally effective, you have to be aware of it.
Yeah, you have
And
to
I
know
have to say, Kiki, like I think that's one, like what, like sometimes like I have this worry thought, like some of these skills people are just like, okay, like you're teaching me how to ask. And like for me it is kind of mind-blowing, and I feel like oftentimes it's like, oh yeah, like I actually have to have a goal. Like it's
Yeah.
helpful to be mindful of your goal going into an interpersonal situation.
100%. I think not only to increase the likelihood that you get what you want, but like for so many other reasons. One specific example that comes to mind really easily, where it's like come up personally to like know what my three goals are in the areas, is if you tend towards people pleasing, you have to be aware of the relationship goal. And maybe all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, this person, I'm not even going to talk to this person again. That doesn't mean you don't want to be nice and validate them, but then that priority goes way down. And then you have to tend towards people pleasing, whatever that means, less for you.
Mm-hmm.
So it helps in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. There is something, unfortunately, which I think is a little deceptive about a lot of DBT skills,
Oh.
which is that on the surface of them, they can seem to be actually very, very simple,
Ah.
like almost too simple. And it betrays the fact that actually they maybe are simple, but they're very, very powerful. Particularly when combined together, they're very, very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be actually an impediment to having some people lean into learning the skills, because they might see, like you said it, Jesse, in real words, like you're just teaching me how to ask for a thing. Well, yes, but actually having that structure around it and having a goal is incredibly transformative and powerful. So
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's worth just calling that out. Is if that's you and you've looked at DBT and you've thought, this seems, I'm not seeing the depth here. It gets pretty meaty and powerful actually quite quickly when you try to put these skills into practice. Okay, maybe we can switch gears here a little bit. We talked a little bit about where to start using or learning interpersonal effectiveness. Maybe we could go actually back and forward at the same time here. Talk a little bit about, you mentioned before that mindfulness plays a role across all the modules. Can you say a little bit more about how mindfulness supports interpersonal effectiveness specifically?
Kiki, I feel like you have been touching on this a bit, and I'm curious.
Yeah. So I think mindfulness interacts with interpersonal effectiveness at every stage of it. So again, mindfulness in understanding myself, my physical sensations, my emotions, my thoughts, my desires. What is it that's happening for me in this moment, interpersonally with this person, that is making me want to say something or say no or get something from them? Like knowing what I want, what my objective is, requires mindfulness. I would argue that then it takes mindfulness to mindfully and skillfully develop the Dear Man script of figuring out, how do I say what I want to say in order to increase the likelihood that I get what I get? How do I do this effectively and non-judgmentally, right? And then I think that gets us into the relationship. Like, required for validation is to approach it with a non-judgmental stance, a skill from mindfulness. So there's that. And then mindfulness is required in listening to and watching the nonverbal reaction of the person that you're speaking to. Literally, what do they say? Do you hear it? How are they saying it? What could that mean? What thoughts and emotions and sensations does that trigger for me, the way that they say what they say?
Yeah.
And then again, rechecking in about, wait, am I getting what I want? How is this going? What do I need to do now? And it just is like ping pong. It's constant mindfulness of deciding, how is this going? Is it going effectively? Am I getting what I want? How do I change gears if I need to and get more of what I want? How do I balance my needs with the needs of the other person? All the things.
Right, and I think that's the piece where the man, right? Because man, that act is all about staying mindful and being able to negotiate, right? Like sometimes we don't get exactly what we want, but there may be room for a negotiation or a middle path, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that both people's needs can get met.
I mean, even written into Deer is to describe. It's like the first skill is using that mindfulness.
Totally.
Okay. That's super helpful. Thank you. Let's switch gears now, go a different direction. Like, what do you see as the primary that you've experienced yourself, or maybe that clients you've worked with have experienced, is like the primary impediments to effectively like using the skills in interpersonal effectiveness?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to what Jesse was saying, factors that interfere with interpersonal effectiveness. Like sometimes it is like I literally don't know what to say. Like I don't know how to say it or what to say. But sometimes, often the case is emotions are getting in the way. You're just too emotionally dysregulated to think clearly and be effective. Or it could be that you really have beliefs that are getting in the way, that need to be challenged. So, oftentimes our own learning history about making requests. It means I'm weak if I can't fix it myself. I shouldn't need help, right? All of these thoughts about relationships can really impact our ability to be effective.
Great. Anything to add to that?
The one I always add is we can be perfectly skillful and still not get what we want. Other times the environment and other people have more power or whatever that they don't want to give us what we want, and that happens.
And Kiki, I think building on that, like, I think there's also, like, I think that's such an important point to highlight for folks, because I think it can feel almost invalidating to this thought, like, I've done all the skills and the environment has not responded in the way. And I really do want to highlight that what's really fucked up is that environments will respond differently to different types of use of interpersonal effectiveness based on different people and different identities.
Yep.
And
Can you
like I'll
give
say this, like as a cis white man, like I can communicate certain things in certain ways, and I will get a different type of response than perhaps another person would.
Yeah.
So the use of these skills is unfortunately not going to look the same across every individual based on their own individual identities and the cultures in which they operate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really, really important to highlight for folks, because I wouldn't want anyone to sort of arrive with the impression, oh, I'm going to use this skill and it's going to look the same for me as it would another person. Because that's unfortunately not the reality in which we live in.
Right.
I'm curious, Kiki, Alicia, anything any thoughts that you'd want to add on that?
I'm really glad you brought it up. I think this is where the mindfulness comes in again, of recognizing and radically accepting the society or the community that we live within and how we're being received by the other person, and using it as information to then decide, okay, do I want to like change and be more diplomatic or apologetic or whatever it is that I feel like I'm being forced into because of how I look and appear to this person? Or do I not want to, recognizing for self-respect reasons, recognizing that it might make me less likely to get what I want.
Yeah.
But it's a constant battle, and it's not, maybe this is a judgment, but it's certainly not a fair fight, if you will. People have different experiences with skills.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also, this is different. Well, I'm just thinking about the biosocial model a little bit too. And I definitely have had, especially with my young adult and teen clients who really are trying to be more interpersonally effective and will report that they practiced their dear man, they brought their dear man in, and it's just not getting the response that they want. And partly because, unfortunately, the environment has gotten, will only in some ways keeps reinforcing dysregulation. Like that is when they take it seriously, when there's a big emotional reaction. And if the person calm and talking in a more skillful manner, they're not responding. And so dysregulation is actually getting reinforced because that's the only way I can be heard. And so that's why oftentimes family work is so important, along with,
individual
learning these skills.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And And I just also want to highlight, as we're sort of on this topic, that like, these interpersonal effectiveness skills, as all the skills, were created in a specific time and context and was mostly studied for a specific type of population of people. It was mostly studied like for cisgender Caucasian women.
Mhm.
And that's not to say that these skills aren't necessarily valuable, and we need to recognize that, like, that there's a cultural context, and that some of
Mhm.
these skills may feel at times more relevant or less relevant depending on your cultural experience. Remember talking with folks about like the no apologies, and like how depending on your experience that might not be what is effective.
Mhm.
I just want to just bring
Yeah.
attention to
Yeah.
that.
I mean, I
Even another specific example, right, in the give skills, I forget in which letter, but it talks about make eye contact and don't
Yes.
interrupt. And that would be very difficult, if not impossible, for certain neurodivergent people.
Yes.
Mhm.
And I want to say, like, as someone that like is like culturally Jewish, like interrupting is a cultural form, that like a legitimate cultural form of communication. Like not interrupting would be seen as potentially disrespectful or disengaged.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're speaking to the fact that over the arc of these conversations that we've had, one of the things that I think a listener would take away is that there is actually a broad portfolio of tools in DBT. And part of the value of that, the breadth of those tools, is that you can pick and choose the
Mm.
ones that are going to be relevant to you and are going to work in your context. I think there's just a certain, like, you're acknowledging the need for a flexible use of these skills, both flexibility in terms of combining them in different sequences, but also flexibility in terms of choosing things from within the portfolio, or maybe even adapting things within the portfolio to your particular context. But it's kind of like this incredible toolbox full of tools.
Yeah.
You still have to learn to use them and put them to work in your particular context.
And the entire goal is having people determine what their wise mind is, right? And how do they build their personal life worth living. So it's just offering, as you're saying, a toolbox. It's a perfect metaphor, I think, rather than like a prescription.
Yes.
Okay, that's helpful. That's a good, maybe I have a question that's actually I've been thinking a lot about, because our program is a group program, and you know I there is something about interpersonal effectiveness skills in particular that lends itself, I think, to learning and practicing in a group setting, which is not to say that we don't use interpersonal effectiveness skills in one-on-one conversations. Of course we do. But there's something about learning them in a group setting that creates like potential for a diversity of interactions that I think is interesting. I'm just curious if you all have thoughts on that. Do you think that there's a connection between the skills that are in interpersonal effectiveness and like an environment like a group where you can learn them? Or do you think it doesn't matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that oftentimes, especially, I mean, having done obviously the Therahive, groups, and also there is something about being able to talk through interpersonal situations with the group and getting feedback from the group, and like that, feeling of not only like I'm not alone, but also like hearing other people navigate these things can be really useful. And then also practicing. I mean, in our, at the center here in the Bay Area, we do have like the multifamily groups. They often will practice. We're like practicing the skill together in the group. So being able to work on your Dear Man script, deliver the Dear Man, like actually practice validating each other. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're skills that need to be practiced.
And like I think, yeah, Alicia, to your point, it's like there's a couple ways in which I think we imagine in, like, let's say, skills groups and all variations that like these like practicing comes up.
Mhm.
I think one, it's like homework review or home practice review. Then there is like potentials for like interactive, like really prescribed, okay, like so and so do this XYZ. Um, I don't like it, and it's interesting because I like working in different group environments. There's not always a space in sort of what we think of as like regular comprehensive DBT to have like a more processy, free flowing thing where we are really being mindful of the skills and practicing them. And it's an interesting concept. Like, what would it be like if instead of having it be prescribed, we're just like, okay, this is a process group in which we are solely focused on practicing DBT, interpersonal effectiveness skills.
Mm-hmm.
Don't hate it as an idea. It's interesting.
Love it. And I think I like it because of some of the experiences that in a group setting that I have found most interesting and insightful and useful for my own learning has been when we like do kind of a popcorn of people trying to validate in different ways or assert the same thing in the same way or try to say, and when playing the dime game, well, I think a 6 out of 10 is this, and like all of a sudden you're like, oh my god, I would never say it that way, but you hear something that you would say, and like so you learn from that, or you give them feedback about like, just so you know, that just came out so aggressive to me, obviously that's on me, but just so you're aware, people in your environment might have that reaction. Like you get to learn from one another about not, again, what's right or normal, so not putting judgments on it, but just getting feedback about different people's different worldviews, lenses, lived experiences of these skills.
This is your comment there just brought me right back to like some previous workplaces where I've been, where I just feel like I wish we had that, where people were able to actually articulate out loud how they're interpreting, because you could say something, somebody else hears it completely differently, and if it's not recognized and acknowledged and put out there, then it just kind of accumulates and leads to resentment, leads to a lot of, I think, bad outcomes for teams, which is why the reality is a lot of us spend a significant portion of our time and life at work, and in many cases, we're spending more time with our work colleagues than we are with some of our family members, right? So these are really important relationships. And I think, I just see a real connection there to bringing some of these skills into that space.
And I want to highlight, like, it is a very, I'm trying to think of how to say this. It is not an easy time for lots of people. And like our political environment, as we enter into like the full-on election year, like there's a lot of opportunity for misinterpretation and for ineffective mind reading. And I think like all the more reason, whether you're in a workplace or you're in a family environment, to start practicing these skills. And Roland, I think you're also making sort of an argument for dialectics, which is,
for sure,
can we begin to hold sort of multiple truths? Can we hold those tensions?
Yeah. I love that. We've got about 7 minutes left. So I got maybe one or two more questions, and then we're going to move to wrap up. If there's a last question from the people who are in the live, feel free to post it. I'm looking at the comments as we talk here. So the question that comes to mind is one about how to handle situations where interpersonal effectiveness strategies, and you kind of touched on this before, but like if you're getting stuck and it's just not working. Alicia, I love the example that you shared a minute ago of the young adult or adolescent going into an environment where they felt like they were practicing this. So, but can you say more about like, what do you do next in that situation?
Yeah, if you're trying to be effective and it's not working.
Yeah.
I think sometimes you can have a conversation about the conversation, and that can be an interesting pivot. Yeah, it's very meta. But I do think that sometimes is a way to kind of be like, hey, like, I am trying to be effective here, like a describe, right? And assert, I feel like I'm putting in effort in improving our communication, like asserting, and then reinforcing, like, in order for me to continue to want to practice these skills that you're paying for, right? Especially the child talking, I need to feel like this is like, can you join me in working with me to like, how can I get my needs met? Like, I really want to go, to that concert on
That's
Saturday.
going back to
What can I do, right?
to the thing that you were talking about before, Kiki, where it's like it's two people regulating together. There's something about kind of like breaking a wall by being like here about just acknowledging the thing, which seems pretty powerful.
Yeah, and I think for oftentimes, there is actually a whole sheet on this in the skills book around like, when like having difficult conversations and using Dear Man for that, because like if you, for example, you're saying no to a request and someone is continuing to badger you and not taking your no, you can deliver another conversation about that. Like, hey, I am saying no. My no is not going to change. Right.
Is there a time and place, like, at what point would you tell that individual to be like, hey, now it's time to change the channel? Like, you're not going to get what you want from this, the radical acceptance, and like, make a new friend or leave this.
Right.
This is not
right. Yeah, or that like you're not going to engage in the conversation anymore. Like we're done having this conversation, right? And yeah.
Okay. So that is a part of interpersonal effectiveness too. Like making the decision that like, okay, I'm not going to invest more here.
Yep. Ending problematic relationships or whatever it's called. I forget what the two adjectives are.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, we spent 45 minutes talking about interpersonal effectiveness.
Wait, Roland, can I, before we finish up, can I just say one thing? Because I did see it in the list of questions, and I just want to just address this. Okay, there's a lot of use of this word boundaries, like maintaining boundaries. And here's what I just, and I'm curious, Alicia and Kiki, like if there, I just want to highlight for folks, like in DVT, sort of like our relationship to this word boundaries. We tend to refer to limits instead of boundaries. And I think it's helpful to let folks know this for two important reasons. One, limits are flexible. Depending on the context and the situation, our limits with someone may change. And we want to be in a position where we can adjust those limits if needed. It's very hard to sort of draw a line in the sand and then some extenuating circumstance comes along and all of a sudden we're like, oh crap, now I have to go back on everything I said. The second thing is like the idea of a boundary is that it's like one and done. Okay, I've made this boundary, it's wall, it exists. When in reality, like a limit takes effort. It takes repeated effort to maintain a limit. And I think that with this idea of boundaries, we sort of convince ourselves, okay, I've made a boundary, now I can just walk away. When in fact, in interpersonal relationships, that is unlikely to be the case. It takes effort to maintain limits. Kiki, Alicia, anything that...
No, I agree with that.
I agreed. And to your point about it takes effort, we are also responsible for our own limits in the sense of we can assert them and the person may or may not respect our request, whatever that is, but then it is our responsibility based on our limits to then set contingencies and follow them. As in, what does this mean now? Am I not going to talk to this person? Am I going to end the relationship? Am I going to now only talk to them about X, Y, or Z, or leave the room when they talk about A, B, and C, or whatever it is? Like, we're responsible for our own behaviors that help us maintain those limits, which is a lot of work.
Yeah.
Awesome. Jesse, thanks for sharing that last bit to tie a bow on this conversation. I just want to remind people who have been here and who have been participating all along that this is just one in a series of 4 conversations that we've had about the different modules of DVT. This will be posted to our YouTube channel like the other ones. So if you want to go review those or view them as a set, please come back and visit us. And I just want to close out by thanking you, Kiki, for going on this journey with us. Yes. It's been really wonderful, enlightening, educational to learn from another voice, another practitioner who's helped us or helped me, I'll just speak for myself, enrich my understanding of these modules and DBT in general. So thank you so much for being part of this. And I do hope we'll have other opportunities to collaborate together.
And before we also, Kiki, can you just let all folks know any exciting things that you've got coming up or things that you want folks to know about? I feel like I'm one of those podcast people. Where can they find
you? Yeah, so I do have a book, which you already mentioned, and I am working on a couple new things that I will be able to release to the public sometime soon, I hope. But if you'd like to hear about them, learn more about what I'm doing, which is all about making DBT skills more accessible, exactly like their Hive, then you can follow me on any social media, DBT Kiki, or my website, kikifehling.com.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh my God, thank you. I love these conversations. I love your brains. Let's do it again.
Yeah, that's good.
Bye.
Bye.